Hello, this is Wood Stuff with Hutch, and today I'm really excited because I'm able to bring you a video that's a furniture build. Finally able to do this. I've got some furniture jobs, and stay tuned because I got a big one coming up, a cherry 5-piece bedroom set, but that's for later. So in this video, I'll be building this side table or end table. My father-in-law was looking around and couldn't find what he was looking for to put on his 3-season porch. He loves to spend a lot of time out there. And this is something that he hired me to do. So I made a quick design and he liked it. So with this is going to be made out of hard maple with modern hardware and a soft close drawer and a floating shelf. And since this is going to be subject to a lot of temperature changes, I wanted to make sure that this could easily move back and forth, although this low on the legs, it probably wouldn't do anything anyway. But in any case, with the way this is constructed, we're going to be using various methods, machine work, trying to do some very straightforward, simple techniques. And then we also get to work on our chisel techniques. We got some chiseling here for making the shoulders of some tenons, as well as these mortises down here. In any case, let's get going. So to start with, I just broke down my rough lumber into rough sizes, and here I am getting ready to run them through the planer after I flattened one face on the joiner. And at this stage, I just want to leave them all oversized. I'm not taking them down to final thickness. I've left these pieces oversized so that I can stack them in a way where air can get around all sides as I let them set and move and acclimate to the shop. This is a way to make sure you can keep your board straight by coming back and re-straightening, re-flattening them, and replaning them. These will set for 3 to 5 days, although I usually like to do it as long as possible, and in this case, I think I let them set over a week. Now, after having them acclimate to the shop, it seems like they've stayed pretty straight and flat, so I go ahead while they're oversized and start preparing them for glue up. And here I'm just joining an edge and taking a look at different grain patterns as I set up and mark the different panels that will be glued up. So once I'm satisfied with the joints, I take them over to the bench and I prepare for glue up. And here since it's just a butt joint, I go ahead and put glue on one of the faces, not both. Give it a good healthy coat, and I just clamp them together, and that's all I need. So this is the top glue up or the shelf glue up, I don't remember which. But when using pipe clamps of this nature, you got to be careful with how much they pull, and they can actually change the shape while gluing and put a cup in it. So I'm just taking care to make sure that the pressure is even on both sides by alternating the clamps top and bottom, and just being real careful to double check that it is staying flat under pressure. And once they've dried, I go ahead and scrape off the glue and then clean off the excess glue with my sander in order to make sure that there aren't any bulbs creating a surface that might not lay perfectly flat on the planer. Now we move on to the legs, again waiting till they've completely acclimated to the shop, and I run 2 faces on the joiner to make sure they're flat, and then just take them to the planer and mill them down to the finished size. In this case, it's 1.25 inches square. So at this point, I've taken my shelf panel and my top panel over to a buddy shop and run them through his wide belt sander down to the finished thickness of 3/4. This is the tabletop, and I can immediately take it down to its final dimensions. The shelf panel will remain oversized for now. So the table saw obviously left some blade marks on the edges, so all I need to do is take my orbital sander and clear away all those saw marks and make the edges smooth. Now, Not all sanders can do this very easily. This is Festool and they're very stable and it works fine. So in other cases, I've also just used a sanding block. Now that the edges have been prepared, I take a 30-degree chamfer bit and route the underside of the tabletop on all four edges. Moving on to the legs, I go ahead and cut them to finish length. So the legs are longer than the fence on my table saw sled, and it's easier to set up a block on the table saw fence. So I set that way it gives me clearance at the blade and the piece won't bind, but the pieces will still come out all uniform length. Now I move on to the sides and the back of the table. I'm joining an edge and I'll rip them to final width. Here I have the tabletop and I'm working on the underside. I'm going to establish how big the overhang is. In this case, I think it's about an inch to the edge of the chamfer. And this will give me something to reference to make sure I get the length and the width of the base just perfect. Here I'm taking the back and the sides to the table saw and preparing them to cut the tenons. In this case, I'm leaving them about an inch longer than the visible length. That way I can account for half-inch tenons. Now we get to move on to our joinery. And this is my marking gauge. It used to have a scratch point on it, but with the file I've modified it and sharpened it into a chisel point so that it'll create the kind of clean line rather than a rough line that I want. That gives me something to drop the edge of my chisel into later. And here I've set the gauge to about a ½ inch, and we're going to go ahead and mark all four sides, making sure we've got a clean, somewhat deep line to allow our chisel edge to drop into later. And here's what the marked out tenon looks like. Now I take a look at the legs and I lay them out and mark them according to what I want in the front and the back and left and right. I check them for color and grain pattern and put what I think are the best legs facing forward. Here I use my square to mark out the approximate maximum length of the mortise that I'm going to be making, and this will just be made on the table saw. I've decided that I'm going to take a precaution and go ahead and incise a chisel line at the maximum length of the tenon, and this is just going to ensure that once I run it through the table saw, if I go a little too far, it won't blow out a chip into the visible portion of the leg. Back at the table saw, I've set up a 1/4 inch wide stacked dado head, and I've gone ahead and made sure that the depth is set correctly for the mortises. And here I'm just marking out the front of the blade where it comes up at the table to make sure that when I do this stop cut, I know exactly where I should be ending my cut. Now we're ready to go ahead and make the stop cuts. Here you want to make sure that you use push blocks, keeping your hand away from the blade, and also making sure that it's tight against the fence so no bobbles occur, so that you ensure that your mortise is a uniform thickness and isn't wider than you want it. For those who are not legally allowed to use a stacked dado on their table saw, you can just do this with a single blade, or you can make this using a router table. I've gone ahead and widened my stacked dado to about 5/8 of an inch, and using an auxiliary fence, I've set it up so that I can take a cut and cut the tenons so that they're not all the way to the cut line, the shoulder line, the marking gauge line. And here you see I have a backer block, making sure that I don't have excessive blowout on the back side of the cut. Again, this is a process that can be made using a single blade rather than a stacked dado, or you can also do it on your router table. And here you can see the marking gauge line, and that I've only left maybe a 32nd of an inch or 1 millimeter left so that I can go ahead and chisel this shoulder to its final dimension. Now I go ahead and take these sides and back over to the bandsaw and nip off a little bit of the tenon in order for them to be able to seat properly in the radius cut of the mortise that was created by the table saw blade. Here I'm just checking the fit and making sure everything is as it should be, and it looks like I've got it all set. And now here comes one of the parts that I consider extremely fun and satisfying. We're going to go ahead and cut the shoulder of the tenon down to its final dimension using a chisel. And here I just tap the chisel down about 1/16 of an inch so that it's straight. And then I don't mind if the chisel starts undercutting the shoulder line because that's not important. The most important part is the part right out at the edge or the face that's visible, and this way it'll go ahead and seat perfectly when we've completed all of our chisel cuts. And now taking the workpiece, clamping it in my vise with the bottom edge facing up, I go ahead and take my chisel and clean up the bottom straight to the marking gauge line. I only go a little distance, and then I go ahead and grab a chisel that is narrower than the thickness of the workpiece and clean up the rest. So you can see why this is my favorite way of making tenons. It creates a perfect joint, absolutely no gaps, as long as you just take care with your chisel work. Now we're getting very close to being able to glue up our base, and in preparation for that I just go ahead and sand the sides and the back and the legs to 150 grit. But before we can glue up, there's one more thing we need to do to the legs. I've designed this to have a floating shelf at the bottom. This is going to entail more chisel work, and here I need to mark out exactly where the mortises are. Here you can use any kind of marking knife. In this case I'm just using a razor blade, but I'm making sure that I make cuts with the blade always on the area that's going to be chiseled away, and this is because I want to make sure that the edge that remains visible is clean and seats perfectly against the workpiece. And here you can see the finished layout with the markings in place. Now to remove the bulk of the waste, to save us on all of our chisel work, I'm taking a Forstner bit that's about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch smaller than the final width of the mortise, and just taking out the bulk of the material. Now using my chisel, I can pare away the excess wood and slowly sneak up on my final marking gauge line. In this case, it'll take a few different passes, and I leave about, again, a 32nd of an inch left to my marked line in order to give as little wood and resistance as possible for my final cuts. If I'm not careful and leave too much wood at my final cut, once I drop the chisel into the line and start pounding down, it'll push back against the marking line and it'll compress the fibers, and then all of a sudden the mortise will be wider in that spot than I wanted it to be. When approaching the final cuts at the corners, I go ahead and just incise a little line with the edge of my chisel right down into the corner. That way I can easily take my chisel down and not worry about having to guess exactly where the corner ends. And again, we can undercut after we've incised at the surface with the chisel, meaning you can tap down 1/16 of an inch square to the face, and then you can let it undercut at this point. What's not visible isn't that important, especially as this is going to be a floating shelf and is not going to be a glued joint at all. And I just flip the piece and go ahead and do the final cleanup cuts on the other side of the joint, and just make sure that, again, I undercut it just a little and clean out all the chips properly. And here you can see the finished result. A nice clean mortise, and it's the exact thickness of the shelf. And again, I'm going to sand the faces before I glue up, but around the areas of the mortises for the sides and back, I take extreme care just to lightly go over them so I don't deform the face in any way. I don't want to over sand there because I want to make sure that the joint remains true and perfect like how they were when I was dry fitting. Rather than trying to glue up the base all at once, I'm going to do this in sub-assemblies. So this is the side sub-assembly, and here I'm going to try and place the glue in a way that there's very little towards the outside face so that I get very minimal squeeze out. Now I go ahead and put glue on all faces, meaning on the inside of the mortise as well as the face of the tenons. And I also want to make sure that when I'm putting the joints under clamping pressure, I don't accidentally pull the legs off square, because you can do that when they're under clamp pressure. So I just want to take a look and make sure that everything's remaining nice and even and square, so that when I take the sub-assemblies to glue up the next step, the joint for the back will fit as it should. Here I'm working on just cutting a, I guess you'd call it a stabilizing block, so that when I go ahead and glue the three sides of the base together, not having a fourth side, it'll need a block in between that opening in order to make sure that the rear legs stay square to the back. You'll see what I mean in just a second. And now I clamp everything together so that I can get a dimension for my floating shelf. You know, the legs could be really perfectly square, but they also could be off by 1/16 of an inch. So in order to make sure the shelf fits very tightly, I go ahead and wait to this point to cut it to final dimension. So I've gone ahead and cut the floating shelf to final size and sanded all the edges. And in order to make sure that the shelf fits perfectly, I sanded the edges with a sanding block rather than an orbital sander, so that hopefully they stayed nice and square. And in the meantime, I go ahead and do my glue up, but then I find there's something missing. Whoops, I totally forgot to put in the floating shelf. So taking everything apart, I go ahead and just scrape away the glue from the joints and go ahead and proceed to glue it up properly. And now it's time to go ahead and begin working on the drawer. For this, I'm using 12 millimeter or 1/2 inch thick Baltic birch plywood. Most of my drawer boxes are made of this, unless the customer makes a request for solid wood. Here I'm just cutting the sides to width, and then I'll go ahead and cut them to length. Since I'm using modern drawer slides, there's not very much stress on the drawer box. So I just use a regular rabbet joint for this box. And here again, I've set up the stacked dado to cut these joints. But again, this can just be made using a single table saw blade or your router table. After those processes, I go ahead and cut the groove for the bottom of the drawer. And since I'm using Bloom drawer slides, I take the back of the drawer box and I go ahead and just trim off the groove completely so that I can just slide in the bottom of the drawer, and you'll see that in just a little bit. Before gluing up the drawer box, I go ahead and make sure that I sand the inside faces, and I'll worry about the outside faces later. So now it's time for me to go ahead and glue the drawer box up, and because I'm using plywood for this, sometimes that can really absorb the glue quickly. So I make sure that I put glue on both parts of the joint, both the rabbet as well as the end of the back and front. Once it's all tacked together with 18 gauge nails, I don't really use clamps for this, I just use nails. If I said clamps before, that was an accident. But in any case, I go ahead and check it for square at this point. Once the glue is dried, which in this case I think I just let it glue overnight, I filled the nail holes and I go ahead and sand the outside of the drawer box. Here I'm just knocking off the corners of the plywood. Sometimes on this Baltic birch it can be very splintery on the corners, so I just want to make sure they're nice and smooth. Time to measure for the drawer bottom, and this is just all straightforward, and then I go to the table saw using what is 6mm MDF core maple veneered plywood and cut the drawer bottom to its final dimension. So you may be wondering what's going on with the front of the table base, and there's going to be a rail. That's what I'm going to cut now, but it needs to be notched in order to seat behind the leg and be able to be attached to the side. In this case, taking into account the thickness of the drawer front as well as the 1/8" rubber bumper that will be on it, I've gone ahead and set my table saw to a depth of 1/8 of an inch. I've put in a flat bottom tooth blade, and I'm going to mark out where the notches go, cut those, and then after that go ahead and dry fit and cut it to final length so it'll fit between the sides properly. Since this really isn't going to be seen and it's not particularly structural, I decided I'd go ahead and attach the front rail with pocket screws. Also, there's a rear rail that I need in order to hold up the hardware, and that's what I'm installing right now. Now after that, I'll go ahead and put in the front rail as well, just using fine threads pocket screws because this is hard wood. Turns out the self-drilling pocket hole screws don't do quite as good a job of clearing out the material as possible, and I got a split. So now it's time to go ahead and do a repair. I go ahead and tape off the edges to reduce the amount of glue that'll get on the finished work pieces, and I use this razor knife to help me open it up while I squeeze in the glue with the brush, and I'll just clamp it down and let it set for a little bit. And at this point, I noticed that some of the leg joints weren't 100% closed, but they were very flexible, so I decided to pin the floating shelf with 23 gauge pin nails. Now those are just basically little wires. They're strong enough to hold the joints closed, but it certainly won't prevent any wood movement. Also, the pin nails are so small that once you put a little wood filler on them, you won't even see them. Once the repair is done, I go ahead, take off the clamps, remove the tape, and sand away any excess glue. After removing the screws so that I could make the repair, this front rail is only being held by glue, so I decided to give it a little bit more strength by shooting in a couple of 18 gauge nails. After having set the heads of the nails, I go ahead and do final glue cleanup. I look around on every single joint and carefully with a sharp chisel pare away any of the dried glue that's visible. And now I'm ready to go ahead and do the finish sanding. I've filled the pinhole nails on the floating shelves, and I'm going to go ahead, sand away any pencil marks that may be remaining, and I'll also go ahead and break all the sharp edges on all of the parts, and then we'll be ready for finishing. After having coated it with a couple coats of polyurethane, in this case sprayed on polyurethane, I realized I forgot to consider how I was going to attach the top. And originally I was going to use Z-clips, but instead I'm just going to go ahead and use pocket screws. The next step is to create some spacer blocks for the drawer slide hardware to be screwed into. The legs and the sides have about 1/4 of an inch reveal, so I go ahead and plane down some 1/4 inch maple and just pin them in place with some 18 gauge nails. At this point I'm ready to attach the top, so I take a foam pad that's clean and doesn't have any dust on it, set it on the bench, flip over the top, and go ahead and measure the reveal on all sides. In this case, it's approximately 1 inch. Once that's done, I go ahead and clamp it in place, and I'm ready to go ahead and just drive the screws. At this point, I've installed the drawer slides in the table base, and now I can assemble the drawer box. And the bottom just slides right in, and I'm only going to attach it at the back. In this case, I'm using upholstery staples, but you could use brad nails or screws or whatever you like. And here I'm just installing the drawer slide hardware. Again, these are Bloom brand, but you could use various kinds of hardware or just do wood on wood like the traditional way. And now you can see me installing the drawer, and it fits just fine. To install the drawer front, I've drilled some oversized holes in the front of the drawer box, and you can see these broadhead washer head screws are what I'm going to use to attach it. For starters, I'm going to go ahead and grab some double stick tape that has some pressure sensitive adhesive, and this will allow me to temporarily hold the drawer front in place while I drill the screws that will attach it. I go ahead and drive the screws into the center of the oversized hole, and that allows me the ability to take off the drawer front, remove the tape, and then position it and have a little bit of slop and play to go ahead and dial in the gaps around the drawer front. Now I just grab some rubber bumpers. Again, I counted for these earlier, and I stick them onto the back of the drawer. After marking the center of the drawer front, I drill the hole to install the knob, and then we are pretty much done. So there it is, a finished piece, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. That said, I definitely learned a few things. Probably need to brush up a little bit more on my chisel work and joinery work that I do by hand. But overall, I'm quite happy, and I'm looking forward to see what my father-in-law says, and I'm guessing he will like it as well. So thanks for sticking with me, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.